Our profession historically has been hideously bad at measuring risk and prioritizing, right? We haven't had the models, we haven't had the skills, the data skills, those sorts of things to do a good job of measuring and communicating about risk. I've gone into organizations and they've shown me their top 10 cybersecurity lists. They create a list. Their boards oftentimes ask, what are our top 10 cybersecurity lists? And they put a list together. And I've gone into a number of organizations and looked at those lists, and not once did they get it right. In fact, not once were they even close. But the good news is the model itself, FAIR, is modeling how risk works, not how the cybersecurity landscape works. It's agnostic. It can be used to analyze any form of risk. And those fundamental factors don't change.
Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Cyber Narratives. I'm your host, Mathieu Cyber Dr. Coteau. And today we have here Jack Jones, who's the creator of the FAIR standard, as we call it, which is a theory that I've been reading about for quite some time. I have the book right here. Measuring and Managing Information Risk, a FAIR Approach. Jack, welcome to the podcast. Welcome to Cyber Narratives.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Great. So, Jack, first question. Let's start with the story. How did you come up with the idea of the FAIR standard?
It was self-preservation was what drove it, because I was a new CISO at Nationwide Insurance at the time. And as a new CISO, one of the first things you have to do is put together a strategy and then go beg for the money to implement your strategy. And I went on my dog and pony show to the executives there, and one of them asked me, so tell me, Jack, how much risk do we have? And I was prepared to talk about threats and vulnerabilities, but he was asking about risk. I shrugged, I said, lots. And he said, if we spend these millions of dollars you're asking for, how much less risk will we have? And I knew I was in trouble then. I sort of hung my head and said, well, we'll have less risk. And he knew he wasn't going to get a better answer than that. It was a teaching moment. He was telling me that unless I could speak in those terms, I was just really expensive noise as far as he was concerned. And I took the lesson to heart because I figured if I didn't, I would have a short tenure. And through my conversation with him, it became obvious that what he was concerned about was exposure to loss.
Mm-hmm.
And so I used that as sort of the starting point. I said, okay, risk is exposure to loss. Exposure is, I assume, probability or frequency, and loss is how painful is it. And I just began decomposing those two starting points, if you will, into this ontology that's the FAIR model. And that was the beginning. In the early days, it wasn't even quantitative. It was still qualitative because I, at that point, did not have the quantitative chops to do that defensively. And so it was qualitative, and I learned over time how to quantify it and apply it in more sophisticated ways.
That makes sense. That must have been something when you're a high person like this says that you got to find ways of measuring risk. And that makes a lot of sense, especially in an insurance firm. All insurance is all about risk. Could you have an example of how FAIR can be applied to, let's say, a less risk conscious type of organization?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, all organizations that I'm familiar with would like their money spent cost effectively, right? And executives I've encountered over the years all would like to know what they're getting for their investments in anything, and certainly in cybersecurity. And historically in our profession, it's just been kind of a dark hole they dump money into. But if you can offer them an opportunity to begin to understand what they're getting for that, or at least that their money is being spent cost effectively, being able to express sort of the risk reduction return on investment that they get, then I have yet to encounter an executive that isn't interested in that.
Makes sense. I mean, we've talked about, risk quantification as a help in terms of making the right decisions in terms of where to put your money. Have you found any other use cases for quantifying or assessing your risk?
Sure, a lot of use cases. One being what I like to think of as smart compliance. So a lot of organizations are subject to regulations or standards of one sort or another, but all of those requirements are not created equal, right? organizations have to prioritize. They can't do everything all at once. They have to make choices. And I found, because every place I worked as a CISO, it was regulated. And I found that being able to more thoroughly understand and quantify and communicate about risk to those regulatory stakeholders and whatnot was very effective at getting additional support from them. It kind of changed prior to being able to think and work in these kinds of terms around risk. It always became a pissing match between me and the regulator or the organization and the regulator about, well, why didn't you do this? You should have done that, right? And when
Mm.
I can show my homework and say, we chose these priorities for these reasons, I never lost those arguments. And they didn't
Hmm.
even become arguments. And in fact, when I was CISO of a bank, large regional bank, that was regulated by the OCC, as well as other regulators, I gave the regulators a half-day workshop on FAIR when I first walked in the door so that they understood sort of the world, how I viewed the world and how I
Hmm.
was going to approach things. And they loved it. And they actually flew me out to DC to give a full day seminar to their senior examiners. And now the Federal Reserve actually uses FAIR internally.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
so it provided credibility and a platform for dialogue that was more fact based and less opinion based. And so that was really important. One of the other things it did is the model is a framework for critical thinking as much as anything else. And the way I like to get this next point across is I'll ask an audience how many people have had the experience of sitting across from somebody and having what feels like a religious argument about whether something is high, medium, or low risk. And everybody's who's been in the profession any length of time has had those debates about whether something is high, medium, or low risk. And usually in those arguments, the person with higher rank wins, regardless of the
Mm.
strength of their position, right? But when we can decompose and almost forensically examine each side's position and argument through this framework, this model, FAIR, it really changes the dialogue and it becomes much less based on personality or bias or beliefs and a lot more fact based. And so I found that a lot of religious arguments just didn't occur that in the past had. And that improved, certainly it made things more efficient, but it also sort of changed the relationship. So when we would come together for these discussions, there wasn't that tension about getting ready for a street fight sort of thing.
Yeah. It's like there's a common language. I think it's funny what you say, Jack, because there I come from a data background, a data management background, and a lot of what we're seeing, with the creation of Fair, with I believe was 2005. There's been a lot of growth about the importance of data within companies,
Yeah.
and when you talk about things like being able to argue with people with higher rank and things like this, it's like we're creating another truth that everyone can come around and argue. So I think it goes towards, and I never saw it that way, so it's very interesting
Yeah.
to see it that way.
I, I like to think of it as a very nascent, but a good starting point
Okay.
for a more scientific, fact based, data based understanding of our problem space, which should allow us to be far more effective, right? If the our profession historically has been hideously bad at measuring risk and prioritizing, right? We just we haven't had the models, we haven't had the skills, the data skills, and those sorts of things to do a good job of measuring and communicating about risk. And as a result, that means we aren't prioritizing well. We have a big signal to noise problem,
Mhm.
and that is a huge advantage for the bad guys because the bad guys have advantages we can't do anything about, right? They get to choose their targets and their timing and techniques, and there's not a lot we can do about that. But when we hand to them on a silver platter the fact that we can't prioritize to save our souls, that's a gift. And we can't afford that gift. The practices of the past, the well, it feels medium to me. The heat maps and those sorts of things, the ordinal scoring of controls and thinking you're measuring risk, those are noise generating beasts
Mhm.
and aren't helping. If anything, they hurt.
Yeah, Jack, that's a very good point because when I was researching FER initially, people were pointing out the same thing at quantitative models. Like you do have some guesswork to it in the same way that you have qualitative. So, what would you answer to people that say it would be unthinkable to quantify certain aspect of cybersecurity risk?
Well, people who think they can't quantify this need to read Douglas Hubbard's books on how to measure anything, because he puts that to bed. I mean, he tears that argument apart completely and far better than I could. So there is no rational, defensible argument for we can't quantify this. It's been proven we can. Now, what some people still have a problem with, though, is this notion of precision. A lot of people, especially with engineering backgrounds, like to measure things to, 3 decimal points of precision.
Hmm.
That's a pipe dream in risk, right? Our problem space, and not just our problem space, but many risk domains, are far too dynamic and there are far too many unknowns to measure with high precision. But you can still measure accurately. And that's something, the difference between accuracy and precision is something I had to learn when I was first developing FAIR because I didn't understand the difference. I was fortunate working at an insurance company. I could have conversation or senior actuaries. In fact, the senior vice presidents of the actuarial departments at Nationwide were my sounding board as I was developing FAIR. And one of the things I didn't understand in the beginning was the difference between accuracy and precision. Think of accuracy as truthfulness and precision as exactness, right?
Hmm.
You can have something that's accurate but not precise, right? If I were to say my income on an annual basis is between $100,000 and $300,000 a year, well, that's accurate, but it's not precise. It's not, there's a range there. Accuracy is still incredibly useful. I mean, in fact, it is, in my view, the king of your measurement criteria. You need your measurements as much as possible to be accurate. The precision is a nice to have, right? If you have the data to get highly precise measurements, wonderful. But in much of our problem space, we don't have enough of the right kind of data to have a lot of precision. So our inputs and our outputs tend to have ranges, right? Wider ranges. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That is the nature of the beast right now from a data perspective. And it's invariably still far better than medium or high, right? It cracks me up that people say they have heartburn about uncertainty in quantifying measurements, and then they fall back to high, medium, and low. That's
Hmm.
ridiculous. That's laughable from a lot.
Because ultimately, it's even more guesswork to put it in one of these three categories.
Invariably. Yeah. So yeah, all of the people I've encountered who argue against, they express their concerns about guesswork and quantification, revert to something that is invariably much worse and seem to be fine with that. And I've just never understood that. So,
Yeah, yeah. There's different view on things. One thing that I've also seen is that we talk about data and putting right numbers. There's
mm,
definitely two sources of numbers that I can come up with. Number one, the data from open source, like things that will rank vulnerabilities, or two, the cybersecurity tools. Usually, corporations will have up to tens, if not almost 100 tools sometimes. Can they leverage these and just be settled? Why do we need more tools?
well, they may not need more tools, but they may need different data from the tools they have. So, for example, vulnerability scanners that leverage, say, CVSS as a scoring calculus. CVSS as a scoring model is broken in a whole bunch of different ways. and frankly contributes tremendously to the noise that organizations face in trying to prioritize and deal with stuff.
We understand why it's flawed. What
Oh,
about it makes it so
uh,
bad in taking decisions?
how much time do we have? So,
It's okay.
no, no, no. But I'll mention a couple of things. First of all,
Okay.
uh, you, math. Are you familiar with sort of the limitations of math on ordinal scales? Um,
I don't think, no, I
yeah.
don't think
Okay.
so.
So you would never do math on, what's red times green divided by yellow, right? That would make no sense whatsoever, right?
Hmm.
So if we change those colors into words like high times medium divided by low, again, we that would be ridiculous.
Mm.
But then we say, oh, instead of high, medium, and low, we'll use, 3, 2, and 1, right? We use numbers, and we think we can do math on that. Those numbers are text. Those are text labels for buckets, just like high, medium, and low, red, yellow, green. There is literally no difference. You are doing math on colors when you're doing math on ordinal scales. Okay. And it has been shown empirically through studies to lead to really bad outcomes, really bad decisions. Again, Douglas Hubbard does a great job on this, and there are other folks out there that have written extensively on this. So math on
So,
ordinal scales is a really bad idea. Um,
okay, so to confirm then the scoring system for vulnerabilities is bad because it uses qualitative and then does math out of these qualitative attributes given to vulnerability.
yeah, and to make matters worse, their scale is a 1 to 10 scale, right? But they go into decimal points to three decimal points of precision
Oh, wow.
on math on colors. Again, it's absurd. Another problem with it is, and this is less a problem with the model and more about how people use the model, and that is the model is ignorant of the loss implications, loss magnitude implications. It's ignorant of compensating controls. It's ignorant of the threat landscape that you're in. CBSS doesn't know or care about whether a server is directly internet facing or deep within a segmented network. It's going to score the things the same.
Hmm.
But clearly, they matter differently, right? The findings are not the same, but that model doesn't recognize that. But again, most of the use I see of the model, virtually all of it, people accept the scores at face value and don't consider these other factors. And again, that just generates a bunch of noise and needless work. When I was a CISO at that same bank,
Hmm.
we used a vulnerability scanner that used CVSS, and it generated all this crap information. And so what we did is we fed the output from that into a tool I had someone on my team build that accounted for are the assets where these vulnerabilities are being found? Are they internet facing? Are they, deeper in the network? What are the value liability characteristics of the assets they're on? That sort of thing. So we had this much better filter, and but it was still relatively crude, but it reduced by an order of magnitude the number of critical and high risk findings we had, which means we could focus so much more effectively on the things that really mattered. And in fact, the prior to making that change in how we approach vulnerability analysis, we could never, our organization never hit its SLAs for patching. We were always deficient in hitting that, which means the auditors and regulators were always eating our lunch, right? They were always giving us
Mm.
a hard time
Mm.
about that. After this, not only could we hit those SLAs, but we actually made our SLAs more stringent, right? Instead of having to patch criticals and highs within, I don't know, it was 30 days, we cut it in half, right? So we could not only focus more effectively, we could knock out those things much more quickly because we had a better filter. So again, the tools that we have, and vulnerability scanning is just one. They feed us a lot of data, but it's oftentimes either not the data we need or it's badly formulated data.
Hmm. So, if I understand correctly, then we still can use to some aspect the data about how strong a vulnerability is. We just have to take into consideration the business aspect in terms of everything we talk about. What
Yeah.
ultimately is at risk?
Yeah.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. When we go on social media, there's so many talks all the times about cybersecurity being in constant evolution. You always need more technology. You always need new things, etc. FAIR is arguably a perishable, let's say, program, right? Because it's at a certain time. Well, if you do an assessment, maybe I'm answering my own question here a bit. What's your take on let's say modeling risk at a defined time?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. So the risk landscape changes. So the evaluation that you did last year or even last month or something like that or yesterday could conceivably change as say the threat landscape changes or the business that you're modeling changes, that sort of thing. The good news is, and that's just the nature of the beast. But the good news is the model itself, FAIR, is modeling how risk works, not how the cybersecurity landscape works. It's agnostic. It can be used to analyze any form of risk. And those fundamental factors don't change, right? The bottom line is FAIR is first principles based. So it's defining how the world works. Now, kind of like gravity, you know,
Mm-hmm.
we may be able to create different rockets or one thing or another may change, or our weight may change or something like that, but gravity doesn't change.
Yeah.
And so FAIR itself has proven to be very resistant to the need to change fundamentally. The landscape you're analyzing using it does change. And so you have to be aware of those changes and continue to update your analyses. And that's been one of the criticisms of FAIR is, well, if we analyze it today, then tomorrow the landscape might have changed and our results yesterday won't be valid anymore. And that's absolutely true, which is one of the reasons why it's important to evolve the tools we use to automate FAIR analysis. So you can accept telemetry from your technologies and that sort of thing and analyze in a more real-time basis. That's absolutely important. But until we have that, we still need to be able to make, for those things we measure, we need to be able to measure them as well as we can, given the resources we have. Because we can't do it perfectly and instantaneously doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It just means we have to be more selective and aware of what we analyze and when we analyze and that sort of thing. So our profession is in the very early days. We're actually a very young profession in the
Mm-hmm.
grand scheme of professions. And so we're still evolving our technologies and our understanding of our problem space. And we are where we are right now in terms of that maturity. And we can wish for more and we can work towards more, but it's kind of silly to expect we should be a whole lot further along than we are when we're as young a profession as we are.
Yeah, I think we're still a bit torn sometimes. It's good to have these debates in some parts. Jack, I wanted to answer you about the timelessness part of FAIR, and I actually could I share this much very much when I was reading the book that everything there's some examples out there that could be renewed, but like overall, the whole lesson was still applicable from 2015 easily. I'd like to talk about a quote that I read in the book, which was fun. It was in between parentheses. Maybe we were trying to hide it, but you said we cringe a bit every time we use qualitative ratings, but they still serve a useful purpose.
Yeah.
Can you tell me what useful purpose they serve?
So I still measure things qualitatively sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing wrong with qualitative measurements as long as you understand their limitations and as long as you're not using math on it. And the key thing is you still have to have clarity on what you're measuring. So the example I like to use is when I do presentations to audiences, I very often use this slide that comes up that shows a 12-second video of these three race cars going on a racetrack, and they're going around a hairpin turn, and then they enter a straightaway. And one of the cars is going a lot slower than the other two. But anyway, so I have them watch this, and I ask the audience, how fast are they going qualitatively? Okay. And the answer I always get is fast. Well, they're race cars, of course, it's going fast. Well, is your fast the same as my fast? Maybe I'm thinking minivan fast and you're thinking Formula One fast. Those are two very different fasts, right? Which car was I asking about? Because I said, how fast were they going? Was it, did I mean they as a group or they as the front runner? You know, the audience answered the question without first normalizing on what do we mean by fast? Which car was I talking about? Which part of the track, the hairpin turn or the straightaway? Because very different speeds through those two things, right? So when people measure things qualitatively, right, how how much risk does that misconfigured server represent? Oh, high risk. They just measured something without defining what they just measured. They they don't know, or they didn't explicitly state to anyone else, probably not in their own head either, what kind of scenario, who the threat agent might be, what was at risk, what kind of value liability was at risk, what other controls are in place, any of these sorts of things. People just, when they use qualitative measurements, they just shoot from the hip without even defining what it is they just measured. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take the time to scope your measurement, defining the asset at risk, the threat, the sort of nature of the event and that sort of thing, then you can use quality. And if you have clear definitions of what you mean by high, medium, and low, then you can use qualitative measurement and still make much better informed decisions. Okay. But 99% of qualitative measurements being done in our profession, nobody's even bothered to define what they just measured. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Which is why you
So,
spent a strong chapter explaining in your book what threat community means. And
yeah, yeah. You have to have this foundational understanding of the problem space and sort of the dimensions of the things you're measuring before you can begin to have a defensible measurement, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. And that race car scenario, if I had asked them to tell me, how fast are they going quantitatively, they'd have had to say, well, which car, which part of the
mm-hmm.
track, right? They've had to get down to these sorts of details. But when people are measuring qualitatively, they just sweep all that important stuff under the rug. And the result is their measurements are typically really unreliable.
It's like we're using two different parts of our brain. One is the feeling part, and the other one's the thinking part, the analytical part. So yeah, it's easy to fall into this trap. Talking about organizations, how would you advise an organization today that wants to adopt a fair or quantitative method for measuring the risk? What would you advise them to start with?
Need to start with understanding why they want to do it, right? Because it represents a paradigm shift. I mean, it changes how you think about, talk about, and certainly measure and manage risks. And those kinds of changes are not always easy, right? And so when you're undergoing that sort of change, whether it's this or some other organizational change, it's a really good idea to have clarity on why, what your intended benefit is. And so that everyone's on the same page about why you're going through this challenge of change. And for different organizations, the reasons can be different. So a lot of organizations begin by saying, okay, we want to know what the return on investment is on our security investments. All right. So when we throw a bunch of money into cybersecurity, what are we getting for it? So I've seen organizations set up a rule that says, right, any investment over $100,000 in cybersecurity, there needs to be a cost benefit analysis using FAIR, and clearly valuable as a starting point for organizations. It gives them a foothold, a way to demonstrate value that then they can build upon to use FAIR for more and more things. Have clarity. Don't try to boil the ocean. Start with a relatively limited scope of what you're trying to accomplish, and recognize that risk analysis requires critical thinking skills. And so the people you have doing it need to be critical thinkers. I've seen organizations who are excited about adopting FAIR, and then when they get to the part about, all right, who are we going to have doing the analysis, they look around for a warm body who's not busy, right?
Hmm.
And they'll just grab that person and say, okay, you're our risk analyst. And if the person isn't a critical thinker, they aren't going to be good at it. They aren't going to enjoy it, and it's not going to end well, right? So people who do risk analysis need to be critical thinkers. But if you have those three things, clarity of purpose, limited initial scope, and the right person or people doing it, then you have a far better chance of being really successful with it.
Hmm. That sounds a bit like the definition of digital transformation a bit as well.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. Yeah.
The right people, the right time, the right reasons.
Mm.
Perhaps executive sponsorship as well, which is something you've highlighted
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
well.
And that's that point about, and the way I've written a white paper on adopting FAIR that sort of lays this stuff out. And it starts with find pain, find executive pain that you can solve with good risk measurement, and start there. Because if you solve someone's pain, they're your friend for life, right?
Hmm.
And that's what I was able to do when I first developed FAIR and began applying it. It was many years ago now at Nationwide Insurance. Was I found a pain point that we could dramatically improve upon. And once I was able to do that, I had a lot of executive support.
Hmm. Yeah. All of a sudden, when an executive finds out a pain, it's all a heck of a lot easier to make a project happen.
Yeah. Yep.
Good, Jack. So we have about 10 minutes left. I'd like to do a quick Q&A about different things, and then we can talk about the points after. So just a quick answer, and then we'll talk about it after. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Sure. So in what word, what's the biggest threat in cybersecurity today?
Um, so many to choose from. In one word, ignorance.
Love that. What's the one thing that a company should do to improve their cybersecurity posture?
I have to use one word.
You can use a sentence.
Oh, okay. Measure risk better.
Measure is better. Okay. What's a misconception about cybersecurity?
That it can't be measured.
What is the key trait of a successful cybersecurity leader?
Ooh, great question. Critical thinking.
Love that. All right. Can you describe that might be a tough one. Can you describe the FAIR methodology in one word?
Understanding.
Understanding. Okay. So, like, did you have a favorite question that you like to dive deeper into?
Out of those,
Yeah.
or yeah,
In
um,
general.
or in general, I think the one about the biggest threat is worth diving into because Douglas Hubbard, who I've mentioned a couple of times, and I highly recommend his books. And you might want to even see if he'd be interested in being on your show.
Yeah.
He's a great guy, and I can introduce and recommend you if you like. But he says the biggest risk we face is not being able to measure risk well. And the reason for that goes back to what I said earlier. The cybersecurity landscape is complex and dynamic. As you said, as you pointed out earlier, it's changing all the time, right? And because it's complex and because it's dynamic and because we have limited resources, prioritization is foundational. It's a must-have. Being able to prioritize well is not a nice to have. It's a must-have if we want to have any hope of holding our own against the bad guys, right? And um, and so the inability to identify and focus on the things that matter most is a crushing problem to us in the profession today. And so that's what led me to my uh, my answer to one of your questions was ignorance. Okay. We have this huge signal to noise ratio problem, and we have misplaced faith in practices we've been doing for decades. Um, that,
Misfaith in practices we're doing it for decades?
yeah. So again, the kinds of risk measurement sorts of things. I've gone into organizations and they've shown me their top 10 cybersecurity
Hmm.
risks. They create a list. Their boards oftentimes ask, what are our top 10 cybersecurity risks? And they put a list together. And I've gone into a number of organizations and looked at those lists, and not once did they get it right. In fact, not once were they even close. Not even close, which means they're not focusing on the things that matter most. They're giving this gift to the bad actors that I mentioned earlier, right? These things are just making our work so much harder than it needs to be. We're so much less effective than we could be. And our biggest threat is this, combination of misplaced faith in silly things we've been doing for years, like math on ordinal scales, and believing frameworks that are pure anatomy are all we need to understand about controls, those sorts of things. So,
Yeah, yeah, I can see that. I'd like to go on the question that you said about the leader. So, what's a key trait of a successful cybersecurity leader? And you said understanding. Can you help us understand why it's such an important trait?
I thought for leader, I thought I said critical thinking, but
Could be.
but I did answer understanding for one of them, and I don't remember which
Um,
one it was.
Maybe it's the second one where you said that what's one thing every company should improve in their cybersecurity button. Maybe
Yeah, that risk measurement. Well, so let's,
critical thinking.
yeah, critical thinking. And I chose critical thinking because, again, we have critical thinking is crucial in any circumstance where there's complexity and uncertainty and different perspectives, right? So someone who's a good critical thinker can look at a complex problem from different perspectives. They're more comfortable with uncertainty, right? They don't freeze up in the face of uncertainty. They can decompose these complex problems into simpler bite-sized chunks. So when we think about our problem space, it is it is all these things. There's complexity, it's dynamic, there's uncertainty. And so if you're leading an organization where you see the world in black and white, right? Where there's just, there's a right way, my way, and there's the wrong way, your way, right?
Hmm.
There's no way you're going to lead that organization successfully from a cybersecurity perspective. No way on earth, right? So the cybersecurity leader needs to be able to deal with these dimensions, these characteristics of our problem space. They also need to be able to put themselves in their executive stakeholder shoes, right? So try to understand from their CIO's perspective, their CEO's perspective, or these sorts of things. Which is another hallmark of critical thinking, is they can put on somebody else's hat for a second, right? And try to understand. They'll never understand completely, but they'll have a better sense. They'll communicate more effectively. They'll listen better, these sorts of things. That's why I believe critical thinking is so crucial for a cybersecurity leader today.
Makes sense. Another trait that sometimes people associate to cybersecurity leaders is being technical. What would you say to people that say that cybersecurity leader should be technical?
Yeah, I don't think it's a nice thing to have. There's advantages to that, but you can't be. I guess it's a matter of how technical, right? Because you're not going to find the unicorn that is the CISO, that's a critical thinker, can communicate effectively with executives, and is really, really deep in all the technical dimensions of cybersecurity. Those unicorns are unicorns. But I don't think the CISO can be ignorant of technology, but they should surround themselves with people who are deep in the technology dimensions. I mean, I came up initially when I was starting out in this profession. I came up very technical. I started off in the late '80s disassembling viruses as a hobby. When I wrote programs, I wrote it in machine language. Right, I was very
Oh wow.
technical. I did attack and penetration work, again, very technical, and eventually stumbled into cybersecurity leadership. But even though I had that very deep technical foundation, as fast as things move, I do not view myself as technically deep today. And I haven't for a long time because it hasn't been a focus. Now I have, I think, a decent foundation. I can ask the right questions and those sorts of things, but I make it a point, have made it and continue to make it a point to surround myself with people who are deeper in those areas where I'm not deep. And I think any CISO should do that because it's kind of silly to think that they're going to be deeply technical in all the things like forensics and red teaming and all the myriad things that are required now.
It's about being polyvalent, perhaps being able to take and adapt and think critically.
Yeah.
Jack, thank you so much for being here. Perhaps you can tell us where if people are interested about finding more about you, your services, where can they hear more about it?
So certainly the FAIR Institute, which is fairinstitute.org. It's a nonprofit that is a community of about 15,000 people around the world now. Lots of information there. They can reach me through that. They can reach me through LinkedIn. And that's probably the best ways.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Jack, for all these insights, and have a good one, folks.
Thanks.